The screaming started at midnight. Not the clean, quick scream of someone startled by a shadow or spooked by wind through the trees. This was the sound of a human soul being torn apart by something that should not exist in God's green earth. A raw, animalistic howling that carried across the settlement like a plague wind, waking every man, woman, and child from dreams that suddenly seemed like blessed sanctuary compared to the waking nightmare that had just begun. 15-year-old Katrina Vanderberg pressed her face against the frost-covered window of her family's cabin, her breath fogging the thick glass as she watched something impossible unfold in the moonlit clearing beyond their door. A massive figure on horseback sat perfectly still at the edge of the forest, and where his head should have been, there was only empty space that somehow felt more present, more watching, more alive than any face could ever be. But here's what Washington Irving never told you in his sanitized fairy tale. Here's what 3 centuries of American folklore has buried beneath layers of Halloween decorations and children's ghost stories. The Headless Horseman was real. He was created by us, and his first victim was the man whose daughter was watching him through that window. A man whose severed head was still dripping blood from the phantom rider's saddle, whose dying screams had shattered the October silence just moments before. The horseman raised one gloved hand toward Katrina's window, and she saw the silver ring on his finger. The same ring her father had worn every day of his life. The ring that was supposed to protect their family from the old evils that walked this cursed land. The ring that was now stained with blood that would never wash clean. Tonight, you're going to learn the truth about America's darkest legend. You're going to discover how European colonization awakened something ancient and vengeful in the American wilderness. And by the time we're finished, you'll realize that the Headless Horseman isn't hunting in your nightmares. He's hunting in your history. And the blood on his hands? It belongs to people just like you. Before we begin, I want you to comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you somewhere cozy? Or are you brave enough to watch this in the dark? Let's find out together what really happened in those haunted woods of early America. The autumn wind of 1647 carried more than fallen leaves through the dense forests of New Amsterdam. It carried whispers of something that shouldn't exist, something that rode through moonless nights with the thunder of hooves and the silence of death. But this wasn't the sanitized tale Washington Irving would later tell. This was something far older, far darker, and rooted in blood that had soaked into American soil long before the first European ever set foot on these shores. In the settlement of Tarry Town, 15-year-old Katrina Vanderberg pressed her face against the frost-covered window of her family's cabin. The glass was thick and warped, distorting the world outside into a nightmare of twisted shadows and dancing trees. Her breath fogged the pain as she watched the tree line, waiting for her father to return from his trading expedition. He was 3 days late. 3 days in wilderness, where men simply vanished, leaving behind only hoofprints that led nowhere and the lingering scent of sulfur that made the horses scream. "Get away from that window, child." Her mother's voice cracked like a whip across the small room. Margareta Vanderberg stood by the fireplace, her knuckles white as she gripped an iron poker. The woman who had once faced down wolves and hostile traders now trembled at shadows. Nothing good walks these woods after sunset. Your father knew that. He should have known that. The last words came out as a whisper, heavy with the weight of growing dread. But Katrina couldn't look away, because there at the edge of the clearing where the ancient oak trees formed a natural cathedral, she saw it. A figure on horseback, perfectly still, watching their cabin. The rider wore a dark coat that seemed to absorb the moonlight, and where his head should have been, there was only empty space that somehow felt heavier and more present than any face could ever be. The horse beneath him was massive, its eyes glowing like coals in the darkness, its breath visible in the cold air, despite the creature appearing to need no breath at all. The phantom rider raised one gloved hand in what might have been a greeting or a threat, and Katrina's world changed forever. Because in that gesture, she recognized the silver ring on his finger, the same ring her father had worn every day of his life. The ring that had been passed down through 7 generations of Vanderburg men. The ring that was supposed to protect them from the old evils that had walked this land since before memory began. The Headless Horseman wasn't just hunting in their woods. He was hunting with her father's soul. 3 months earlier, when the summer heat still shimmered off the Hudson River, an old Lenape shaman named Wapalan had appeared at the Vanderburg trading post. His weathered face bore scars that told stories of battles fought against enemies, both human and otherwise. He moved with the careful grace of someone who had walked between worlds and returned to warn the living. The other Dutch settlers avoided him, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. But Johannes Vanderburg had always been different. He spoke the Lenape tongue and understood that some warnings came at the cost of a man's life. "The Gandagwan walks again," Wapalan said in his heavily accented Dutch, his dark eyes never leaving Johannes's face. "The Headless One. Your people's coming has awakened something that should have stayed buried beneath the sacred stones." He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in birch bark. Inside were bones, carved with symbols that predated any European script, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. This land remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it. It remembers the wars before your wars, the deaths before your deaths. Johannes set down his ledger, giving the old man his full attention. Other traders would have dismissed such talk as savage superstition. But Johannes had lived here long enough to know that the land itself held memories. He had seen trees that bled sap red as blood, heard voices in languages that no living tongue could speak, found animal bones arranged in circles that no natural predator would create. "What does it want?" he asked simply. "Souls," Wapalan replied, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The Gandagwan was once a war chief, beheaded by enemies in a battle so fierce that the earth itself cracked open. His rage was so pure, so consuming, that death could not contain it. For generations, my people have kept him sleeping with rituals and offerings. But your axes have cut down the guardian trees. Your plows have disturbed the sacred burial grounds. The balance is broken, and he rides to restore it with blood and terror." The old shaman stood to leave, but paused at the doorway of the trading post. Outside, the forest seemed to lean in closer, as if listening to every word. "There is a way to stop him, Dutchman. But it requires a sacrifice that your people may not be willing to make. It requires acknowledging that this land was never yours to take, and some prices must be paid in full." With those words, he vanished into the green shadows of the woods, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sage and the growing certainty that Johannes Vanderburg had just been handed his own death sentence. Pastor Cornelius De Vries was not a man easily frightened. He had survived the ocean crossing that claimed half his congregation, faced down fever epidemics that turned strong men into skeletal shadows, and preached salvation to communities that teetered on the edge of starvation and madness. But on the morning of August 15th, 1647, when young Willem Janssen failed to return from his evening hunt, De Vries felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning mist rising from the river. Willem's horse had returned alone, its eyes white with terror, foam still clinging to its muzzle. The animal wouldn't let anyone approach, rearing and screaming whenever someone tried to grab its reins. Most disturbing of all, carved into the leather of the saddle were symbols that hurt to look at. Spiraling patterns that seemed to move when observed directly, as if they were alive and writhing with malevolent purpose. The horse's flanks bore similar markings, burned into the flesh with supernatural precision, forming designs that predated Christian iconography by centuries. The search party found Willem's musket 3 miles into the forest, still loaded, unfired. His powder horn hung from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze like a hanged man. But there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Instead, they found a perfect circle of dead grass, 30 feet in diameter, where nothing would ever grow again. In the center of this blighted space lay Willem's hat, and beside it, a single black feather that crumbled to ash when Pastor De Vries tried to pick it up. "This is the work of the devil himself," De Vries declared to the gathered settlers that evening, his voice carrying across the small community like a death knell. "We must purify this land with prayer and fire. We must drive out whatever evil has taken root in these godless woods." But even as he spoke, he could see the doubt in their faces. These were practical people who had carved a life from wilderness through hard work and determination. They believed in God and providence, but they also believed in axes and muskets and the strength of their own hands. Johannes Vanderberg stood at the back of the crowd, the Lenape bones heavy in his coat pocket. He watched the pastor's face in the firelight and saw something there that chilled him more than any supernatural threat. The terrible certainty of a man who would burn the entire forest to save a single soul. De Vries was already planning something drastic, something that would disturb far more than sleeping spirits. As the crowd dispersed, murmuring prayers and checking the locks on their doors, Johannes made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. He would seek out Wapalan again. And this time, he would listen to everything the old shaman had to say about prices that must be paid in full. The sacred grove lay hidden deep in the heart of the ancient forest, where trees older than memory formed a natural cathedral beneath the stars. Wapalan had led Johannes through paths that seemed to shift and change with each step, past streams that ran uphill and clearings where the very air hummed with power that made his teeth ache. This was not land that had ever been touched by European axes or claimed by Dutch property deeds. This was a place where the original inhabitants of the continent had once communed with forces that Christianity had tried to forget. "Your pastor speaks of driving out evil," Wapalan said, as they approached a circle of standing stones that Johannes was certain hadn't been there moments before. "But the Gondagwan is not evil, as your people understand it. He is balance. He is the land's memory of every injustice, every broken treaty, every sacred place defiled. Your people see only wilderness to be conquered. My people knew this land as a living entity that must be respected, propitiated, honored." The old shaman's voice carried the weight of generations, and Johannes could hear the ghosts of his ancestors speaking through him. In the center of the stone circle lay the skull of some massive animal, bleached white by countless seasons and carved with symbols that predated human civilization. Around it, arranged in precise patterns, were offerings that told the story of every culture that had ever walked this land. Lenape tobacco and corn, Dutch silver coins, French glass beads, English iron nails. Each item had been placed with ceremonial precision, creating a map of cultural collision and conquest written in sacred objects. The binding ritual requires a willing sacrifice, Wapalan explained, his weathered hands moving among the offerings with practiced reverence. Not death, but something more precious. The acknowledgement that this land was taken by force and must be returned in spirit, if not in deed. The Gandagwan feeds on rage and injustice. To stop him, someone must offer themselves as payment for their people's crimes. They must carry the weight of every broken promise, every stolen acre, every sacred grove cut down for farmland. Johannes stared at the ancient skull, understanding finally settling over him like a burial shroud. The ritual wasn't just about stopping a supernatural threat. It was about justice, about finally paying a debt that his people had been running from since the first European ship touched American shores. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Wapalan's smile was sad and knowing, the expression of a man who had watched his world die by degrees and still found the strength to offer salvation to his destroyers. "Then the Gandagwan will take what is owed, one soul at a time, until the debt is paid in full. Your pastor's fire will only make him stronger. Your muskets and prayers will only feed his rage. But if one of your people willingly accepts the weight of what your culture has done..." The old shaman didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Pastor De Vries stood before his makeshift altar in the common house, his normally steady hands trembling as he held the leather-bound Bible that had traveled with him across an ocean of trials. The book fell open to Exodus, to the verses about driving out the inhabitants of the land, about showing no mercy to those who practiced abomination. Behind him, 37 of Tarry Town's most devout citizens clutched crude torches and iron implements, their faces grim with holy purpose. They had come to purge the wilderness of whatever evil had claimed Willem Jansen. But their pastor had convinced them they were doing God's own work. "The Lord has delivered us into a land of milk and honey," De Vries proclaimed, his voice rising to fill the small room. "But like the Israelites of old, we must drive out the demons that infest this place. The savages worship devils in their groves. They commune with spirits that are an abomination unto the Lord. Tonight, we carry the fire of righteousness into their dark places and cleanse this land once and for all." The Bible slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot, and the assembled crowd murmured their agreement, though more than one face showed uncertainty in the flickering torchlight. What Pastor De Vries didn't tell his followers was about the dreams that had been plaguing him for weeks. Visions of a horseman without a head, riding through forests that burned with unholy fire. In those dreams, he always stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between saving his flock and preserving his soul. The dreams came with whispers in languages he didn't recognize, telling him secrets about the land that made his Protestant certainties crumble like sand. He had begun to suspect that the wilderness itself was alive, conscious, and deeply angry at the European intrusion. The mob moved through the forest like a plague of locusts, their torches turning the ancient trees into dancing demons and their own shadows into monsters that stalked alongside them. They found the first Lenape sacred site just after midnight, a small grove where smooth stones had been arranged around a natural spring, where offerings of tobacco and carved bone lay undisturbed by time or weather. De Vries declared it a place of devil worship and ordered it destroyed, watching with grim satisfaction as iron tools shattered stones that had stood for 1,000 years. But as the last sacred stone cracked and fell, something changed in the forest around them. The very air seemed to thicken and grow cold, carrying the scent of old blood and burning bone. In the distance, they could hear hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, getting closer with each passing moment. Pastor De Vries raised his Bible like a shield and began reciting the 23rd Psalm. But his voice cracked on the words about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, because he was beginning to understand that they hadn't been destroying evil tonight. They had been feeding it, giving it exactly the kind of rage and violation it needed to manifest in the physical world with unprecedented power. The hoofbeats came first, echoing through the forest like thunder before a storm. They carried a rhythm that was wrong somehow, too slow to be natural, too steady to be made by any living horse. The men of Pastor De Vries's mob clutched their torches tighter, casting wild glances at the darkness between the trees, trying to locate the source of the sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But Johannes van der Berg, following at a distance with Woapalan's blessing burning like ice in his pocket, knew exactly what was coming for them. The Gandagwan appeared at the edge of their torchlight, like a nightmare given form. The massive black stallion beneath him moved with fluid grace that defied the laws of nature, its hooves striking sparks from stones that should have been too soft to kindle fire. Where the rider's head should have been, there was an absence that hurt to perceive directly. Not emptiness, but a void that seemed to pull light and warmth and hope into itself, leaving only the cold certainty of judgment. The figure wore a military coat that might have been from any century, any army, its brass buttons gleaming with malevolent intelligence. "Demons!" Pastor De Vries screamed, raising his Bible high above his head. "Back to the pit that spawned you. In the name of Christ, I command you to..." His words cut off abruptly as the Headless Horseman turned toward him, and the pastor felt the full weight of the entity's attention. It was like being studied by something vast and ancient and utterly without mercy. Something that had watched civilizations rise and fall and found them all equally wanting. The Bible in his hands began to smoke, its leather binding curling away from pages that suddenly seemed blank. The horseman raised one gloved hand, and 3 of the mob simply vanished. Not killed, not struck down. They were there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sulfur in their abandoned torches guttering in the dirt. The remaining men broke and ran, screaming prayers and curses in equal measure, crashing through the underbrush with the desperation of prey animals. But the Gandagwan didn't pursue them. Instead, he turned his terrible attention toward Johannes van der Berg, who stepped out from behind an ancient oak with his hands empty and his heart full of terrible resolve. "I know what you want," Johannes said, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to crush his chest. "I know what must be paid." The horseman remained motionless for a long moment, and Johannes could feel himself being weighed and measured by intelligence older than human civilization. Then, slowly, deliberately, the phantom rider extended one hand toward him, an invitation, a summons, a final chance to save his people from their own ignorance and greed. Johannes van der Berg, father and traitor, took a deep breath of the cool night air and stepped forward to accept a burden that would transform him into something far more terrible and necessary than he had ever imagined possible. Johannes van der Berg felt the horseman's touch like ice burning through his veins, rewriting everything he had ever been with supernatural fire. The gloved hand closed around his wrist, and suddenly he could see the forest as it truly was. Not empty wilderness waiting to be claimed, but a living entity riddled with scars from axe and plow, bleeding spiritual essence from 1,000 wounds inflicted by European occupation. Every tree that had been cut down, every sacred site that had been defiled, every treaty that had been broken, he felt them all as personal injuries, a catalog of violations that made his bones ache with accumulated rage. The transformation began slowly, starting at the point where the horseman touched him. Johannes watched in fascination and horror as his flesh became translucent, revealing networks of silver light beneath his skin that pulsed with the rhythm of the forest itself. He could feel his individual identity beginning to dissolve, becoming part of something vast and ancient and implacably just. The Gandagwan wasn't possessing him. It was absorbing him, adding his memories and experiences to a collective consciousness that spanned centuries of cultural collision and conquest. Now you understand. Wapalan's voice seemed to come from very far away, though the old shaman stood just at the edge of the clearing. The Gandagwan is not one spirit, but many. Every soul that has willingly taken on the burden of justice. Every person who has chosen to become the instrument of the land's vengeance. Your consciousness will join theirs, and together you will ride until the debt is finally paid. Johannes tried to speak, to say goodbye to his daughter, to his wife, to his old life, but words no longer seemed adequate for what he had become. The Headless Horseman that had first appeared began to fade, its duty transferred to a new vessel. Johannes felt himself lifted onto the massive stallion, felt the reins materialize in his hands like extensions of his own nervous system. The horse was no ordinary animal. It was a construct of pure will and ancient magic, capable of existing in multiple realms simultaneously. Through its eyes, he could see into the spirit world where the true scope of European violations became visible, as wounds in the fabric of reality itself. As his human head dissolved into mist and memory, Johannes van der Berg's consciousness expanded to encompass every injustice committed on American soil. He became the Headless Horseman, not through curse or damnation, but through choice. The terrible, necessary choice to become justice incarnate in a land where justice had been buried beneath layers of manifest destiny and divine providence. The last thing he experienced as Johannes was the weight of his daughter's future pressing against his transformed consciousness. A love so pure it would survive even this metamorphosis and drive him to find a way to break the cycle of vengeance that had claimed his soul. For 7 nights, the Headless Horseman rode through the settlements around Tarry Town, and 7 nights brought 7 disappearances that followed no pattern the surviving colonists could understand. He took the blacksmith who had made horseshoes from iron stolen from sacred Lenape burial sites. He claimed the miller whose wheel had been built over a stream that 3 tribes considered holy. He vanished the merchant who sold blankets infected with smallpox to native villages, thinking his crime would never be discovered by European justice. Each disappearance was precise, surgical, targeted at those who had committed specific violations against the indigenous inhabitants of the land. Katrina van der Berg pressed her face against the cold window night after night, watching for her father's return while not understanding that she was actually witnessing his transformation into something beyond human recognition. The horseman she saw in the tree line wasn't hunting her family. He was protecting them, using his new supernatural senses to guard against threats both mundane and otherworldly. But his presence was a double-edged sword. because every night he remained near their cabin. Every moment he spent watching over his daughter, the barrier between worlds grew thinner. The surviving members of Pastor De Vries' mob began experiencing waking nightmares that followed them into their daily lives. They saw phantom horsemen in every shadow, heard hoofbeats in every gust of wind, felt the weight of invisible eyes watching them from the forest. Some tried to flee back to the safety of New Amsterdam, but they found that roads which had been straight and true now led in circles, bringing them inevitably back to Tarry Town. The land itself had become a prison, holding them accountable for the violence they had committed in the name of religious purification. Pastor De Vries barricaded himself in the church he had built with his own hands, surrounding himself with Bibles and crosses and every piece of blessed silver the community possessed. But the protection he sought in Christian iconography proved hollow when faced with a force that predated Christianity by millennia. The horseman appeared to him in dreams that felt more real than waking life, standing in the pulpit of his church, delivering sermons about justice and retribution in a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. The pastor began to understand that his God was not the only power in the universe, and that some sins required more than prayer and repentance to absolve. On the 8th night, as autumn deepened toward winter and the barrier between worlds grew gossamer thin, Katrina Vanderberg made a decision that would change everything. She had watched her mother waste away with worry, had seen their community tear itself apart with suspicion and fear, had felt the weight of her father's absence like a stone in her chest. That night, she wrapped herself in her heaviest cloak, took her father's hunting knife from its place above the mantel, and walked out into the forest to confront whatever had taken the man she loved most in the world. The forest at night was a different world entirely, transformed by moonlight and shadow into a realm where normal rules no longer applied. Katrina Vanderberg walked the deer paths with the confidence of someone who had grown up at the edge of wilderness. But she could feel eyes watching her from the darkness between the trees. Not animal eyes, but something far more intelligent and infinitely more dangerous. The temperature dropped with each step she took deeper into the woods, and her breath began to mist in air that smelled of old snow and older secrets. She found the horseman waiting for her in the same clearing where her father had last been seen alive, standing beside his massive stallion like a monument to everything her people didn't understand about the land they had claimed. Up close, the absence where his head should have been was even more disturbing. Not empty space, but a void that seemed to pull at her vision and make her eyes water. Yet somehow, impossibly, she knew he was looking at her, studying her with an intelligence that transcended physical form. "I know you're my father," Katrina said, her voice steady despite the fear that made her knees weak. "I can feel it. I don't understand what you've become, but I know it's still you in there somewhere." The horseman remained motionless for a long moment, then slowly dismounted from his steed. As his boots touched the ground, Katrina caught a glimpse of the man he had been. A flicker of familiar gesture, a half-remembered way of holding his shoulders that made her heart break with recognition. The phantom figure reached into his coat and withdrew something that gleamed silver in the moonlight. Her father's ring, the one that had been passed down through 7 generations of Vanderberg men. But when he extended it toward her, Katrina saw that it had been transformed. Its simple band now covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, marking it as something that existed in multiple worlds simultaneously. This wasn't just her father's ring anymore. It was a key, a connection a way to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of ancient justice. "You want me to take it," Katrina whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "You want me to become like you." The horseman's headless form nodded slowly, and in that gesture she could read volumes about duty and sacrifice, and the terrible prices that must be paid to maintain balance between worlds. But she could also read something else. Love, pure and desperate, and completely human. The love of a father who would do anything to protect his daughter, even if it meant damning himself to an eternity of supernatural servitude. Katrina Vanderberg, 15 years old and braver than anyone in her settlement, looked at the transformed ring and began to understand that some burdens were meant to be shared. Katrina held her father's transformed ring in her palm, feeling its weight like a living thing against her skin. The silver band was warm despite the cold night air, and the symbols carved into its surface seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Through the metal, she could feel her father's consciousness pressing against hers, not trying to possess or control, but sharing the vast, terrible knowledge that came with his transformation. She saw through his supernatural senses the true scope of what European colonization had cost the land and its original inhabitants. "There's another way, isn't there?" she asked the headless figure who had once been Johannes Vanderberg. "You don't have to ride forever. Someone else can carry this burden, share the weight of it." The horseman's form wavered, becoming translucent enough that she could see the ancient trees behind him. For a moment, she glimpsed the man he had been. Tired, desperate, but still recognizably her father beneath a supernatural transformation. His love for her burned like a beacon in the darkness, strong enough to transcend death and damnation. The stallion snorted and pawed the ground, its breath visible in the cold air despite its otherworldly nature. Through her connection to the ring, Katrina could sense the creature's impatience. It wanted to ride, to hunt, to continue the work of balancing accounts that had been left unpaid for too long. But she could also sense something else, a deep weariness, the exhaustion of an entity that had been forced to serve as judge and executioner for crimes it had never committed. The horse, like her father, was trapped in a cycle of violence that served justice but destroyed everything it touched. "If I take the ring," Katrina said, working through the implications with the careful logic her father had taught her, "I become part of this. But if we both carry it, if we share the burden..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the headless horseman's posture shifted, becoming more human, more hopeful. Katrina could feel the possibility opening up like a door in the darkness, not an end to the supernatural justice that the land demanded, but a transformation of it into something that could heal rather than simply punish. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the forest, but these came from the direction of town. Pastor De Vries and what remained of his mob, armed with torches and desperate faith, coming to destroy whatever evil they imagined lurked in the woods. Katrina looked at the ring in her hand, then at the headless figure of her father, and made the choice that would either save her people or damn them all. She slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling its power flow into her like liquid fire, and discovered that love could be stronger than vengeance when it was willing to pay the price that justice demanded. Pastor De Vries led his remaining followers through the forest with the desperate fury of a man who had staked his entire worldview on a single roll of divine dice. Behind him, 12 men clutched weapons blessed by his own hands, their faces grim with the knowledge that tonight would end either in salvation or damnation for their entire community. The pastor himself carried a cross carved from wood, taken from the first tree they had cut down in Tarry Town, convinced that it would serve as both weapon and shield against whatever demonic forces had corrupted their wilderness sanctuary. They found Katrina Vanderberg standing in the center of the moonlit clearing, her father's ring gleaming on her finger like a star fallen to earth. But she was no longer entirely human. The transformation had begun the moment she accepted the burden of cosmic justice. And now she existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Her body flickered between solid flesh and translucent spirit. And when she looked at the approaching mob, her eyes held depths that no 15-year-old should possess. "Stop," Katrina commanded, and her voice carried harmonics that made the trees themselves lean in to listen. "You've done enough damage. The land is tired of your ignorance. The spirits are tired of your violence. Tonight, we're going to find a different way." Behind her, the Headless Horseman materialized like smoke given form. But for the first time since his transformation, he didn't radiate menace. Instead, father and daughter stood together as guardians of a threshold between worlds, protectors of a balance that required both justice and mercy to maintain. Pastor De Vries raised his makeshift cross, his voice breaking as he began reciting Latin prayers that felt hollow in the face of powers older than Christianity. "Demon spawn. Witch, you corrupt this holy place with your..." His words cut off abruptly as Katrina stepped forward, and he saw in her transformed features not evil, but a terrible, necessary goodness that his theology had never prepared him to understand. This wasn't damnation he was facing, but salvation wearing a form his limited imagination had labeled as monstrous. "The choice is yours, Pastor," Katrina said, extending her hand toward him. On her finger, the ring pulsed with soft light that illuminated the clearing like captured moonbeams. "You can continue trying to destroy what you don't understand. Or you can learn to work with forces that were here long before your God claimed dominion over this continent. The land wants peace, not more blood. But peace requires acknowledgement, compromise, respect for what was here before." The 12 men behind De Vries lowered their weapons, sensing truth in her words, even if their leader remained too proud to accept it. The pastor stared at the offered hand, understanding finally that his moment of choice had arrived. He could continue his crusade and doom his people to an eternity of supernatural warfare. Or he could accept that his vision of divine righteousness was incomplete, requiring balance with older forms of wisdom. The cross in his hands felt suddenly heavy, carved as it was from wood taken without permission from a forest that had never belonged to his people. Pastor Cornelius De Vries, servant of God and student of divinity, looked into Katrina Vanderberg's ancient eyes and made the decision that would determine whether his settlement survived the winter or vanished into legend like so many others that had tried to claim this haunted land. Pastor De Vries let the wooden cross fall from his trembling hands, and as it struck the earth, something fundamental shifted in the spiritual architecture of the forest around them. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on Tarry Town for months began to lift, replaced by something that felt like the held breath of the earth finally being released. Katrina stepped forward and placed her transformed hand on the pastor's shoulder, and he felt the touch not as corruption, but as absolution for sins he hadn't even known he was committing. "This land remembers everything," Katrina explained, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "Every broken treaty, every sacred site destroyed, every act of violence committed in the name of civilization. But it also remembers every act of kindness, every moment of respect, every person who chose understanding over conquest. Through the ring's power, she showed him visions of what the continent had been before European contact. Not empty wilderness, but a complex network of thriving cultures that had lived in harmony with forces his people dismissed as superstition. The Headless Horseman moved closer, his supernatural form becoming more solid and less threatening with each step. As he approached, Pastor De Vries could sense the intelligence behind the terrible absence where a head should have been. Not demonic malevolence, but a grief so profound it had transcended death itself. This entity wasn't evil. It was heartbroken, tasked with enforcing justice for crimes so vast they could only be balanced through supernatural intervention. But now, with Katrina sharing the burden, that justice could be tempered with mercy. "We can't undo what's been done," Katrina continued, addressing the 12 men who stood witness to this unprecedented moment of reconciliation. "But we can acknowledge it. We can learn from it. We can build something new that honors both the old ways and the new." She gestured toward the forest around them, and the men could see it with new eyes, not empty land waiting to be claimed, but a living entity that could be partner rather than victim if approached with proper respect and understanding. As dawn broke over the forest, painting the ancient trees with gold and crimson light, a new compact was forged in the clearing where two worlds had collided and found a way to coexist. The Headless Horseman would ride no more as an agent of pure vengeance, but would serve instead as guardian and guide, helping those who came after learn to live in harmony with forces older than human memory. Katrina Vanderberg, transformed by love and justice in equal measure, became the first of a new kind of interpreter. Someone who could speak both languages of civilization and wilderness, helping her people understand that true prosperity came not from conquest, but from cooperation with the spirits of the land itself. The ring on her finger pulsed with gentle light as the sun rose, its symbols shifting to reflect not just ancient justice, but the possibility of a future where different cultures could share the same sacred space without destroying each other. In the distance, the bells of Tarry Town began to ring, calling the community to morning prayers that would, for the first time, include gratitude for the indigenous wisdom that had kept this land sacred for countless generations before European ships ever touched American shores. The legend of the Headless Horseman would endure, but not as a tale of mindless terror. Instead, it became a reminder that some debts must be acknowledged, some wounds must be healed, and some forms of justice require the courage to transform vengeance into wisdom. The Phantom Rider still walks the borderlands between worlds, but now he rides not to punish, but to protect, ensuring that the lessons learned in blood and starlight are never forgotten by those who would claim dominion over lands that were never theirs to take. The truth behind the Headless Horseman legend runs deeper than Washington Irving ever imagined. What started as a story of supernatural terror was actually a tale of cultural collision, spiritual justice, and the possibility of redemption through understanding. The Phantom Rider that haunted colonial America wasn't just a random ghost seeking victims. He was the land itself, demanding acknowledgement of injustices that had been buried beneath layers of manifest destiny and religious certainty. This is why the Headless Horseman endures in American folklore, not because he represents mindless evil, but because he embodies our collective, unconscious guilt over the price of colonization. Every generation rediscovers this tale because every generation must grapple with the question of what we owe to those who came before us, and what price must be paid for progress built on others' suffering. The real horror isn't a phantom rider haunting our woods. It's the realization that some debts can only be paid through acknowledgement, respect, and the courage to build something better on the foundations of truth rather than convenient mythology. The Headless Horseman rides still, but now he rides to remind us that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that the ghosts of our past will haunt us until we find the courage to face them with honesty and humility. Comment below and tell me, do you think America has truly reckoned with the spiritual debts of colonization? Or does the Headless Horseman still ride, waiting for a justice that has yet to come?